If a person comes to you and says, I want to get stronger, and that's my primary objective in the weight room, it's more so than the aesthetic, because we're going to talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the principles they need to keep in mind?
So what's interesting is the principles are pretty much the same. It's just the level to which they're applied, right? And I think it's important to point out that, you know, there are diminishing returns with strength in turn. Well, I'm sure there are. I don't think the studies are refined enough to pick this out at this point, because it's not like they're getting a population of powerlifters and looking at their longevity. Yeah. But my guess is that at a certain point, you pretty much get all the benefits, and just getting even stronger is probably not going to give you more.
Especially if it comes at the risk of injury that can later on in life. Yeah.
Sure. And then I think like you also see with like running, there's kind of like a J-shaped curve. Part of me thinks that just the people that take it so far, whether it be powerlifting, running, whatever, that it's not that their sport makes them more prone to early mortality, but more so that they probably have other behaviors of being an extremist that probably contribute to that.
Yeah, interesting.
But as far as strength goes, I mean, really what we're talking about is progressive overload. I mean, that is the most important core principle. And it actually really applies to a lot of things in life, to be quite honest. But when it comes to lifting weights, a lot of people hear progressive overload and they just think weight on the bar. And that is the most simple way to explain it, right? So if you come in, you've never done some sort of squat movement before, and you do 95 pounds for 5 reps. And then the next week you come in and you do 100. And the next week you come in and you do 100, 105.
At the same number of reps.
At the same number of reps, yep. Right. You know, that is a form of progressive overload. And most people, when they enter the gym, that's kind of their experience. They don't need to increase that number. They don't need to really, they can increase their reps, but for the most part, when you first start going to the gym, you're just going to be able to put more weight on the bar pretty much every week. And that is a perfectly reasonable way to progress. And I mean, even, you know, I know we haven't gotten here yet, but people will say, well, you know, I'm postmenopausal woman, or I'm a 75-year-old male. Like, it's too late for me. No, it's not. Now is the best time. In fact, when I was at University of Illinois, where I was in a Department of Nutritional Sciences, right across the street in the exercise physiology department, they were conducting a study on frail elderly. So people who basically almost couldn't really walk. Like, they could, but it was very tough for them. And they just started progressively overloading them. And that looked like basically squatting to a really high chair to start, right? And what they saw was incredible. In like 12 weeks, they actually had people who could squat down to like a below parallel chair and come back up, which may not sound like much for the average person. But when you're talking about somebody who's, you know, frail elderly, the difference in functionality and their lifestyle is going to be incredible in terms of what they can do. So what I'll tell people is what you can learn from powerlifters is that progressive overload, one, in terms of weight on the bar, but nobody's able to increase weight on the bar forever. That's just, it's not going to happen. And the longer you get into it, the more nonlinear it's going to be. It's going to be, you're going to go down and come up and go down and come back up. But there's also other ways to progressively overload. One being more repetitions, and the other being adding more hard sets. So the latter, adding more hard sets, is really something you only need to get to as you get to be more advanced. Because like I said, you're not going to be able to add strength forever, and you're not going to be able to add reps forever either. So, by
the way, this is one thing that from one of our earlier discussions that really started to change my training. I started adding a little bit more set at slightly lower RPE to net increase volume. So I was, I think, doing a lot more RPE 8, 9 stuff, but you can only get a few sets at that level. Like, you're really, really spent. And instead I was saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we do a little more RPE 6 and 7 and add more sets, more volume? One, I feel like it's lowering my risk of injury. And two, as you said, it's really just another way to progressively overload.
Yeah, and you're always weighing those two things, kind of your stimulus versus fatigue ratio. Yeah. And that's something, so I'm coached by a guy named Zach Robinson, who's doing his Ph.D. in Mike Zordos' lab at FAU. Great lab. and he talks about stimulus versus fatigue a lot. And they do a lot of training in that kind of RPE 5 to 6 area, which some people call that easy. When it comes to compound lift, I wouldn't really call it easy. But, it's kind of like, how can we maximize our stimulus and minimize fatigue? And if you're talking about an RPE 9, for example, how many sets at RPE 9 can you get?
I don't know about you. I have like 1 to 2.
Right.
Yeah.
Before you really have to drop the weight down or whatnot.
Or before, like someone like me who's not, at the level that a powerlifter's at, like my form starts to compromise.
Right. And Mike Israel actually had a great kind of take on this too, in terms of like training to failure. He's like, if you take a squat, like a free barbell squat to failure for 10 reps, and then you try to do another set with that same weight, how many reps will you get? I mean, I know from doing sets to failure of 10 reps of free barbell squat, I might not even be able to get like 2 or 3 reps on my next set because it's just so fatiguing. So that is one thing that's important to point out when we talk about RPEs, which is kind of a measure for proximity to failure.
Yeah, I guess we talked about it on a previous podcast. Why don't you tell people how RPE works? Because I think it's really a fantastic system.
Yeah.
But you do need to push yourself in the gym to really understand what they feel like.
Yeah, so RPE is kind of it's been adapted from running to lifting, and it's on a scale of 1 to 10, or I guess even 0, but RPE 10 being you had no more reps left. That was your absolute all out, like 100% effort. RPE 9 is you could have done 1 more rep, RPE 8, 1 more rep, so on and so forth. And one of the issues is we know you don't have to train to failure to grow muscle. In fact, it may actually be a little bit counterproductive just in terms of the fatigue that it causes relative to the stimulus. We know that, for most movements, you get most of the hypertrophy and strength benefits going within a few reps of failure. So RPE like 7, 8. And obviously, if you can do more volume, it may be even more beneficial. But the downside is if you've never actually taken something to failure, like true failure, people are really bad at estimating it. And so with beginners and intermediates, they find that they tend to underestimate their RPE by about 5.
Wow.
Which is pretty incredible. And we've seen it in lab. Like we'll take somebody in and they'll put a weight on, they'll do a rep, and
you'll ask them what's your RPE right now?
What was that like? And they'll say their RPE, and then the researchers will actually make them take it to failure while they're like yelling at them and encouraging them. And on average, they'll get 5 more reps than they estimated they would have.
I can totally believe that.
Yeah. Whereas when they look at RPE validity in advanced lifters, it tends to be much more accurate. So there was actually a study. I was in a powerlifting meet where they had a Tendo unit on the bar, and they were measuring our bar velocity, and they were asking us to rate our RPE after every attempt. And they found that RPE, as validated by velocity data, was a pretty good measure in that population of powerlifters because they've taken so many sets near failure. So your point is well taken. Like, you do need some experience of going really hard and really close to failure. But once you have that experience and you understand what that feels like, then you can estimate better. You're probably better off staying a few reps shy of failure and accumulating volume that way, just because going to failure is just so incredibly fatiguing.
So for a person who, again, is not planning to go to a power meet, is there a need for them to go below 4 reps in training?
I would say
that's an arbitrary number, but you know what I'm getting at.
I would say probably not. I mean, you can get plenty strong, even doing, sets of 10, those sorts of things.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't, so that I would have thought you needed to get at least into the 5s and 6s sometimes, but.
So you can get really strong doing sets 10, 15, those sorts of things. Now, you will not be as strong even per cross-sectional area as somebody who trains for strength, because strength is a specific skill. And even like myself, my best squat ever is a 668. And when I was, 6 months out from that, it's not like I added weight to the bar that I was able to squat, but it's not like I added that much more lean body mass because I didn't. I was practicing the skill of a 1 rep max, which allowed me to better do the 1 rep max.
And you were practicing at what percent of ultimately became 661?
Usually around 90, 95, but not very much at 95, mostly at 90 for like singles.
And what was your RPE when you did those singles?
So usually about 8.5 or 9. Yeah.
Okay.
So
you would do multiple of that, just
Yes.
doing the math. Let's just say that's 620 or something like that. Or,
Yes.
Yeah. So let's say call it 600 pounds. So you would do a 600-pound single 3 times in a workout.
something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And what you're kind of making gains on at that point is just it just teaches you how to grind through a lift. Because a lot of people have never had the experience of really sticking with a lift. And interestingly, the more advanced somebody gets in terms of strength, the slower their 1 rep max velocity will be. And we see this in research studies all the time. Somebody who's kind of new will come in, they will absolutely smoke a weight. You put 5 pounds on and then they get stapled because it's just,
they don't have that grind capacity.
They don't know how to do it. And part of that may be psychological, but part of that's probably physiological too.
So interesting.
In terms of you just haven't trained your body to recruit all the fibers that it can get. So, lean body mass and strength are very closely tied together. But when it gets to those finer levels of strength, it's kind of just practicing the actual, 1 rep max. So when it comes to, getting strong, you can absolutely get strong, doing sets 10, 15, because you're increasing your lean body mass. Do you need to do sets of 3, 4? No, but what I would say is don't necessarily count them out because a lot of people actually just do really well with variety. So, periodization was kind of a big thing for lifting back in the day. And now we've kind of shown that, at least in the research studies, it doesn't appear to produce greater gains in lean body mass. Maybe a little bit better strength gains, but that's probably just because people peak better when you're periodizing things. But what tends to actually be shown is that people just tend to like periodization better because they're varying their repetitions. They're not as bored, right? So you never want to kind of poo-poo the psychological effects of those things. I talk about this with diet as well. Adherence is the most important thing, just getting people to come in and do it. So especially for people who are coming into the gym, if they're just trying to get stronger and be healthy, well, for me, if I'm talking to them or coaching them or whatever it is, it's well, what do you enjoy? What's going to get you to show up consistently, right? Oh, you don't want a free squat? That's fine. Let's leg press. There's many ways to skin a cat. You don't want a barbell deadlift? Okay, no problem. Let's do some RDLs, those sorts of things. Slightly less technical lifts that are still going to produce really great gains in terms of strength, lean body mass, those sorts of things. So if you're not going to specifically compete in a strength sport, there's so many paths to Rome in terms of getting stronger and increasing lean body mass. So
do you think there are some principles, for example, let's say a person isn't confident that they have the technical ability to execute a squat or a deadlift. Let's look at a hip thruster. Again, you can screw that up too and you could hurt yourself,
Sure.
But it's a lot harder to hurt yourself doing that. Do you think there is still an essential need for some sort of compound movement like a hip thruster, at least as a complement, or a leg press, as you point out?
It's pretty funny. I went through a phase where everything I learned from the magazines, the bro science, I was like, well, this all has to be junk,
Yeah.
And now we're actually having studies come out that are validating some of this bro science from 20, 30 years ago. So there does appear to be different areas of the leg muscles, the quadriceps, for example, that are better activated by, say, a leg extension compared to a leg press, compared to a squat. So I do think it is good to have variety. I think it is good to have compound lifts as well. And in fact, there's some interesting data that suggests that you don't have to get as close to failure on compound lifts to still get the same stimulation compared to isolation exercises where you do seem to have to get much closer to failure to get those benefits. But I also just thinking about again, if we're kind of like looking at the longevity or the quality of life piece, what is, most analogous to what these people are going to be doing and where they're going to be needing it? Well, if it's bending over and picking something up, that's some kind of hinge, right? Some kind of hinge. If it's, sitting down and standing back up, some kind of squat. Now, you can use variations, right? And I would never, I don't want to say never because it's a superlative, but I very rarely would take somebody who's like fresh off the street and just put a barbell on their back and say, okay, learn how to squat, because I mean, it's going to be like Bambi trying to stand up, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, you're probably going to, maybe even start them off with no weight and just teach them how to hinge, how to use their hips, how to use their knees, how to track, their legs with their feet and those sorts of things, and just balance. Because if you've never like put a barbell on your back, I mean, it's not a comfortable position. And honestly, to do it well, you shouldn't feel comfortable. You should feel very tight, most places. And then like once they're established with that, then moving to where they're like holding a kettlebell in front of them, and then you can progress with weight with that. And then maybe you progress to something like a safety bar, where they're not having to worry so much about hands and whatnot, to a box, and then eventually take the box away. And then maybe then you can progress to a barbell squat.